The words slice through the marble-columned chamber of Federal District Court like a blade finding bone. Ms. Kellens, perhaps you should have brought someone more qualified to represent your interests in federal court. Judge Thornwick Sterling's voice carries the practiced condescension of a man who has weaponized his authority for 15 years on the federal bench. His silver hair catches the overhead lights as he peers down from his elevated perch, thick-rimmed glasses reflecting the fluorescent glare that seems designed to bleach hope from anyone foolish enough to challenge the system. The courtroom holds its breath. Reporters lean forward in the gallery, sensing blood in the water. Court staff exchange glances that speak volumes about what they've witnessed before in Sterling's domain. But Zara Kellen stands at the defendant's table with a stillness that suggests either resignation or something far more dangerous. Her hands rest flat against the mahogany surface, fingers spread wide, displaying none of the trembling that would be expected from someone facing federal conspiracy charges. "Your Honor," she responds, voice level as mountain lake water, "I'll represent myself." Sterling's laugh carries no warmth, just the mechanical precision of a man who has perfected cruelty through repetition. Around the courtroom, spectators shift uncomfortably as Assistant United States Attorney Blaine Corsett rises from the prosecution table, his expensive suit and practiced smile suggesting a man who has never met a conviction he couldn't manufacture. "The defendant stands accused of conspiracy to defraud federal housing programs," Corsett announces, his voice carrying across the chamber with theatrical gravity. Specifically, purchasing residential property valued at $450,000 in the Miracle Mile district while reporting annual income of $38,000 to federal housing authorities. He pauses, letting the numbers hang in the air like smoke signals of guilt. The government alleges this represents deliberate fraud designed to circumvent federal housing assistance regulations. The charges sound rehearsed, polished through repetition until they carry weight that the underlying facts cannot support. Zara's expression remains unchanged, though something flickers behind her dark eyes that suggests these proceedings are being recorded in ways the court recorder cannot capture. Judge Sterling's gavel hovers in the air, suspended in the moment before impact. This should be entertaining. If this injustice made your blood boil, hit that subscribe button right now. You won't believe how this story unfolds when the tables completely turn. More shocking court stories drop every Tuesday and Friday. Don't miss what happens next. 3 weeks earlier, Zara's morning routine unfolds in the cramped efficiency apartment she's called home for 8 months. The space reflects the careful attention of someone who understands that details matter, that every possession tells a story, and that stories can be weaponized. Bank statements arranged in chronological order, lease agreements filed in duplicate, purchase receipts organized by category and date, each document bearing the methodical precision of someone who has learned that survival depends on documentation. The apartment sits in a gentrifying neighborhood where coffee shops charge $12 for drinks that used to cost $3, where longtime residents watch their children priced out of the communities they built with their own hands. It's the kind of place where being black and organized makes you suspicious to people who measure worth in dollar signs and property values. Zara's morning coffee comes from a $5 coffee maker, not the artisanal establishments that have sprouted like weeds after rain. She drinks it while reviewing documents spread across a card table that serves as both desk and dining room furniture. Housing authority correspondence, bank statements showing steady income from freelance legal consulting, tax returns filed precisely on schedule. Everything legitimate, everything documented, everything designed to pass the scrutiny that she knows will come. The knock on her door arrives at exactly 7:32 a.m. because bureaucrats operate on schedules that leave no room for human variation. Gage Whitmore identifies himself through the thin wood as a housing authority compliance officer, his voice carrying the entitled authority of a man who has learned that federal agencies make excellent weapons for people who understand how to aim them. "Ms. Kellens, I need to discuss some irregularities in your housing documentation." His smile appears genuine until you look at his eyes, which hold the cold calculation of a predator who has found vulnerable prey. Just routine verification, you understand. The questioning begins innocuously enough. Income sources, employment verification, residency requirements. Standard bureaucratic theater performed by actors who have rehearsed their roles until they believe their own performances. But the questions carry undertones that transform routine compliance into something approaching interrogation. $38,000 annually from freelance legal work. Whitmore reads from his tablet, stylus tapping against the screen with mechanical precision. That seems quite low for someone with your apparent expertise. Legal consulting rates vary significantly based on client needs and case complexity. Zara responds, her voice carrying the measured calm of someone who has prepared for exactly this conversation. My clients primarily include small nonprofit organizations and community groups. Yet you were able to secure a mortgage for residential property valued at nearly $500,000. The words carry accusation wrapped in bureaucratic politeness. That ratio of income to debt seems unusual. The documentation tells a different story. Inheritance funds from a grandmother who saved every penny for 60 years. Life insurance proceeds from parents killed in a traffic accident. Student loan forgiveness through public service programs. Down payment assistance through first-time homebuyer initiatives. Every dollar accounted for, every source verified, every transaction documented with the precision of someone who understands that Black success requires twice the proof. But proof has never been the point. The point is the process, the harassment disguised as verification, the systematic application of bureaucratic pressure until people break or disappear, or accept that the system is designed to exclude them from prosperity. We'll need to conduct additional verification, Whitmore announces, already knowing that additional verification will become perpetual verification, that compliance will become impossible when the rules change faster than they can be followed. Someone from our fraud investigation unit will be in touch. The first anonymous complaint arrives through official channels 3 days later. Suspicious activity reported by concerned neighbors. Excessive foot traffic suggesting possible drug dealing. Loud parties disturbing community peace. Vehicles parked improperly on residential streets. The kind of complaints that sound official until you realize they describe normal human existence while Black in a neighborhood that has decided Black existence itself constitutes a crime. The police wellness check follows within hours because reports of suspicious activity require immediate investigation when the suspicious activity involves Black homeownership in gentrifying neighborhoods. Officers Martinez and Patterson arrive with the careful courtesy of public servants who understand their every action might be recorded, their voices carrying professional politeness that cannot quite mask the underlying skepticism. We received reports of possible drug-related activity at this address, Officer Martinez explains, his hand resting casually near his service weapon in a gesture that appears relaxed until you understand its purpose. Just checking to make sure everything's okay here. The search request comes wrapped in constitutional language about consent and cooperation, delivered with the understanding that refusal to consent constitutes evidence of guilt in the court of public opinion. Zara's apartment receives thorough inspection by officers trained to find what they're looking for, whether it exists or not. But her space yields nothing more suspicious than prescription medication in properly labeled bottles and legal documents organized with military precision. Everything appears to be in order, Officer Patterson concludes, though his tone suggests disappointment rather than relief. Just be aware that neighbors are watching. Sometimes it's better to keep a low profile. The advice comes wrapped in the language of public safety, but carries the unmistakable message that being Black in this neighborhood requires permission from people who will never grant it willingly. That success must be hidden, achievement minimized, prosperity apologized for until the apology becomes permanent. Banking irregularities begin appearing within days of the police visit. Deposits held for extended verification. Electronic transfers delayed pending fraud prevention review. Credit monitoring alerts suggesting identity theft concerns. The systematic application of financial pressure designed to create the very instability that will justify future intervention. Zara's morning routine expands to include phone calls with bank supervisors who speak in carefully scripted language about security protocols and customer protection measures. Each conversation requires documentation. Every delay demands explanation. All procedures designed to consume time and energy until compliance becomes impossible. Ms. Kellens, we show irregular deposit patterns that trigger our fraud prevention algorithms, explains Bank Supervisor Reynolds, his voice carrying the practiced sympathy of customer service representatives trained to sound helpful while providing no actual help. Large cash deposits followed by immediate electronic transfers suggest possible money laundering activity. The deposits represent legitimate consulting payments from clients who operate in cash economies. The transfers represent mortgage payments, utility bills, basic living expenses handled through electronic banking like millions of Americans manage daily. But patterns become suspicious when viewed through lenses designed to find criminality in normal financial behavior. We'll need additional documentation to verify the source of these funds, Reynolds continues, already knowing that additional documentation will lead to additional questions. That verification will become an infinite loop of bureaucratic requirements that expand faster than they can be satisfied. Until then, we're implementing account restrictions to protect against potential fraud. The restrictions transform banking from routine to ordeal. Each transaction requires prior approval. Every deposit faces extended holds. Account access becomes conditional on proving innocence through documentation that grows more extensive with each submission. The harassment campaign escalates through carefully orchestrated neighbor complaints that arrive through official channels with suspicious frequency. Homeowners association violations for lawn maintenance that meets community standards. Parking citations for vehicles legally parked on public streets. Noise complaints filed during hours when the property stands empty. Each complaint generates official correspondence, creates paper trails, builds case files that transform normal living into documented suspicious activity. Mrs. Henderson from 3 houses down becomes a frequent source of reports about concerning behavior that consists primarily of black existence in a space she believes should remain white. Her calls to city services increase in frequency and specificity, describing violations that exist only in the imagination of someone who has weaponized municipal services against neighbors she cannot legally exclude through other means. That woman has people coming and going at all hours, she explains to Code Enforcement Officer Williams, her voice carrying the practiced outrage of someone who has learned that authorities respond to white women's complaints about black presence with immediate attention. It's clearly some kind of business operation, and residential zoning doesn't permit commercial activity. The business operation consists of friends visiting for dinner, family members stopping by for conversation, and the normal social interaction that home ownership traditionally provides. But normal social interaction becomes suspicious when filtered through racial bias that transforms friendship into evidence of criminality. Federal agents arrive without warning on a Tuesday morning that starts like any other but ends with everything changed. Special Agent Crawford displays credentials that carry federal authority, his voice professionally neutral as he explains that banking irregularities have triggered federal investigation into possible mortgage fraud and money laundering. Ms. Kellens, we need to ask some questions about your recent real estate transaction. Crawford's partner, Agent Douglas, positions himself near the door in the casual manner of someone prepared for flight attempts that no rational person would consider. Specifically, we're investigating potential discrepancies between reported income and actual financial capacity. The questions begin with background verification that sounds routine, but carries undertones of criminal investigation. Employment history, income sources, family financial support, inheritance documentation. Each answer generates additional questions. Every explanation requires supporting evidence. All responses become potential contradictions to be explored in future interrogations. Our investigation suggests possible coordination with known fraud networks, Crawford explains, referring to notes that describe legitimate financial transactions in language designed to suggest criminal conspiracy. Similar patterns have appeared in other federal housing fraud prosecutions. The other prosecutions remain unnamed, their details classified, their relevance unclear except as tools for creating psychological pressure through implied threats of federal consequences that could destroy lives through process regardless of underlying innocence. Banking records receive federal subpoena within hours of the agent's visit. Account access becomes completely restricted pending federal review. Electronic transfers halt entirely, while investigators examine every deposit, every withdrawal, every transaction for evidence of crimes that exist only in the creative interpretation of legitimate financial activity. The federal investigation expands with bureaucratic efficiency that transforms every aspect of normal life into potential evidence. Email accounts monitored for suspicious communications. Social media profiles analyzed for criminal associations. Employment verification extending to clients who suddenly face federal scrutiny for the crime of hiring black consultants. Phone calls from concerned clients begin arriving within days. Federal agents asking questions about payment methods, project details, professional qualifications. The systematic dismantling of professional reputation through official investigation that treats legal business relationships as potential criminal conspiracies. Zara, what's going on? Asks longtime client Maria Santos, director of a community nonprofit that provides legal aid to immigrant families. Federal agents came to our office asking about your consulting work. They're treating our contracts like evidence of some kind of crime. The questions extend beyond professional relationships to personal connections. Friends receive visits from federal agents interested in gift exchanges, family support, social activities that might constitute unreported income or criminal association. The systematic isolation that results when federal investigation transforms friendship into liability. Speaking of legal protection, let me tell you about Legal Shield. For less than $1 a day, you get 24/7 access to attorneys who can review contracts, handle traffic tickets, and provide legal consultation. Don't face the system alone. Visit LegalShield.com/justice as to protect your rights today. Use code JUSTICE for your first month free. The arrest comes at 6:15 a.m. on a Thursday that begins with sunrise streaming through windows of a home that Zara will never see again as a free woman. Federal agents surround the property with overwhelming force typically reserved for violent criminals, their tactical gear and automatic weapons suggesting imminent danger that exists only in the imagination of people who believe black homeownership constitutes federal crime. Federal Bureau of Investigation. Search warrant. The announcement shatters morning silence as agents breach doors with battering rams designed for military operations, their entry creating damage that insurance will classify as law enforcement activity exempt from coverage. Combat boots leave marks on hardwood floors that took 60 years of grandmother's savings to install. The search consumes 4 hours as federal agents inventory every possession for potential evidence. Personal photographs become exhibits. Bank statements transform into prosecution materials. Legal textbooks suggest criminal sophistication. The systematic documentation of normal life reimagined as criminal conspiracy. Zara Kellens, you're under arrest for conspiracy to defraud federal housing programs, wire fraud, money laundering, and making false statements to federal investigators. Agent Crawford's voice carries federal authority as handcuffs click into place with mechanical precision that has ended thousands of lives through process designed to destroy before trial begins. The perp walk occurs in full view of neighbors, whose morning routines include watching federal agents arrest the black woman who dared to achieve home ownership in their carefully segregated neighborhood. News vans arrive with suspicious speed, their cameras capturing footage that will appear on evening broadcasts, with headlines about federal housing fraud and criminal networks that transform legitimate success into evidence of systematic crime. Processing through federal detention facilities follows procedures designed to strip dignity while maintaining legal compliance. Fingerprints, photographs, body searches conducted by officers trained to find weapons and contraband in places where neither exists. The systematic humiliation that accompanies federal arrest, designed to break resistance before prosecution begins. The holding cell smells like disinfectant and hopelessness. Its concrete walls bearing the scratched names of people who pass through on their way to federal prison or deportation or disappearance into systems designed to consume lives without trace. Zara sits on the metal bench that serves as both seating and sleeping surface, her posture suggesting either resignation or preparation for battles that others cannot imagine. Initial appearance before Magistrate Judge Anderson occurs in courtroom designed to emphasize federal power through architectural intimidation, high ceilings that dwarf human scale, polished marble that reflects voices in ways that make speech sound uncertain, seating that positions defendants below eye level of judicial authority that tolerates no challenge. The United States versus Zara Kellens, Bassin, the clerk announces, her voice echoing in chambers where justice gets processed through procedures that prioritize efficiency over accuracy. Conspiracy to defraud federal housing programs, wire fraud in the first degree, money laundering, and making false statements to federal investigators. The charges sound impressive when read aloud in formal legal language that transforms normal financial transactions into federal crimes through creative interpretation of statutes originally designed to prosecute actual criminals. Assistant United States Attorney Blaine Corsett stands to present government arguments with the practiced confidence of someone who has never lost a case because he chooses his targets carefully. Your Honor, the defendant represents a significant flight risk. Corsett begins referring to prepared notes that describe law-abiding citizenship as evidence of criminal sophistication. The complexity of the alleged fraud scheme, combined with the defendant's apparent financial resources and lack of community ties, suggests significant danger of failure to appear. The financial resources consist of legitimate savings and inheritance funds now frozen by federal investigation. The lack of community ties refers to being black in a neighborhood that has weaponized community against minority presence. But federal judges hear what prosecutors want them to hear, especially when defendants lack resources to challenge narratives that transform innocence into evidence of guilt. Furthermore, Corsett continues, the defendant's prosa representation suggests possible mental instability or unwillingness to cooperate with standard judicial procedures. We recommend detention pending trial to ensure community safety and defendant appearance. The mental instability consists of believing constitutional rights apply to black defendants. The unwillingness to cooperate refers to refusing to accept guilt for crimes that exist only in prosecutorial imagination. But federal pretrial detention becomes standard practice when judges assume criminality and require defendants to prove innocence through resources they no longer possess. Bail is set at $2 million, Magistrate Judge Anderson announces, the amount calculated to ensure detention without the political complications of denying bail entirely. The defendant will remain in federal custody pending trial unless bond can be posted through approved surety. $2 million for first-time housing offense represents either judicial incompetence or deliberate intention to ensure pretrial detention that will break resistance through process regardless of ultimate verdict. The decision echoes through courtroom where federal authority demonstrates its power to destroy lives through legal procedures that maintain constitutional appearance while achieving unconstitutional results. The transport van carries Zara to Metropolitan Detention Center through downtown Los Angeles traffic that continues normal patterns while lives get destroyed through federal prosecution designed to terrorize communities into accepting second-class citizenship. The city looks different from behind reinforced windows that separate the imprisoned from freedom that now feels as distant as childhood memories. MDC population includes immigration detainees awaiting deportation to countries they fled for survival, drug defendants facing mandatory minimums for crimes that should be treated as medical problems, and federal inmates whose sentences stretch decades into futures they will never experience. The systematic warehousing of human beings who challenged systems designed to exclude them from prosperity. Cell assignment places Zara with Maria Gonzalez, immigration detainee from El Salvador, whose asylum claim was denied through procedures that assume persecution testimony is fraudulent unless corroborated by documents that persecution specifically destroys. Their conversations occur in whispered Spanish and English that guards pretend not to understand. "First time in federal?" Maria asks, her voice carrying the exhausted wisdom of someone who has learned that federal justice operates according to rules that have nothing to do with law or fairness. "They got you on money charges?" The money charges represent federal prosecutors' favorite weapon because financial transactions always appear suspicious when examined by people determined to find criminality. Every legitimate payment becomes evidence of money laundering. Each legal deposit suggests criminal conspiracy. All normal banking activity transforms into federal crime through creative interpretation that assumes guilt and demands proof of innocence that cannot be provided. "Housing fraud," Zara responds, her voice carrying none of the shame that federal prosecution tries to instill in people whose actual crime involves challenging systems designed to exclude them from success. "They say I committed fraud by buying a house I could afford legally." Maria's laugh holds no humor, just the bitter recognition of someone who has seen federal justice manufacture crimes from legal activity when legal activity threatens established power structures. Her own asylum claim was denied because she couldn't prove the rape that forced her to flee, because trauma testimony gets classified as unreliable when authorities prefer deportation to protection. "They'll offer you a plea," Maria explains with the practical wisdom of someone who has watched federal prosecution destroy lives through process designed to coerce cooperation regardless of underlying innocence. "Take 5 years instead of 20. Admit guilt for crimes you didn't commit. Make it easier for them to do this to the next person." The plea negotiation begins through defense attorney Rebecca Morrison, court-appointed counsel whose caseload includes 67 federal defendants and whose billable hours cannot accommodate adequate representation for any of them. Her expertise consists primarily of pleading clients guilty efficiently enough to avoid federal judicial displeasure, with lawyers who waste court time on constitutional protections. "Zara, I've reviewed your case," Morrison begins, her voice carrying the practiced exhaustion of overworked public defenders who measure success in reduced sentences rather than actual innocence. "The evidence suggests a complex financial fraud scheme that could result in significant federal penalties if we proceed to trial. The evidence consists of legitimate documents interpreted through prosecutorial creativity that transforms legal activity into criminal conspiracy. Bank records showing regular deposits become money laundering. Mortgage payments through electronic transfer suggest wire fraud. Property purchase with documented funds represents conspiracy to defraud federal programs designed to help people achieve exactly what Zara achieved legally. The government is offering 15 years if you plead guilty to conspiracy charges," Morrison continues, reading from notes provided by prosecutors who treat plea negotiations as surrender ceremonies rather than legal discussions. "That's significantly less than the 45-year maximum if convicted at trial. 15 years represents half of adult life spent in federal prison for the crime of buying a house while black. 45 years ensures life imprisonment for challenging systems that prefer exclusion to integration. But federal prosecutors offer these choices with the understanding that most defendants cannot risk trial against government resources that dwarf any possible defense. I didn't commit any crimes. Zara responds with the dangerous naivety of someone who believes innocence provides protection against federal prosecution designed to destroy people regardless of underlying guilt. Everything I did was completely legal and properly documented. Innocence is a luxury that federal defendants can't afford. Morrison explains with the brutal honesty of someone who has watched constitutional protections collapse under prosecutorial pressure that treats defense as obstruction of justice. The conviction rate in federal court exceeds 95%. Trials are just elaborate sentencing hearings. The trial preparation begins in jail law library, where federal prosecution provides discovery materials designed to overwhelm rather than inform. Thousands of pages of bank records, financial documents, surveillance reports, and agent testimonies that transform normal life into evidence of systematic criminality through volume that cannot be adequately reviewed by defendants representing themselves. Zara spreads documents across library tables with methodical precision that suggests either legal training or obsessive attention to detail. Her organization follows patterns that civilian defendants rarely employ, creating timeline charts and evidence correlations that reveal prosecutorial misconduct hidden in bureaucratic complexity. Federal rules of criminal procedure become her constant companion, the dense legal text that most pro se defendants find incomprehensible, but which Zara navigates with ease that suggests formal training in constitutional law. Her annotations fill margins with citations that display unusual familiarity with federal jurisdiction and civil rights enforcement. Girl's got some serious legal knowledge, observes Diana Walsh, federal inmate serving 15 years for tax evasion who maintains her innocence with the persistence of someone who understands that federal prosecution routinely convicts innocent people through processes designed to achieve conviction rather than justice. She's citing cases that most lawyers don't know. The case citations include obscure federal precedents involving civil rights enforcement, constitutional violations, and prosecutorial misconduct remedies that suggest academic expertise beyond normal legal education. Her cross-examination strategy outlines federal courtroom procedures with precision that comes only from extensive experience in federal litigation. Prison phone calls receive federal monitoring that transforms every conversation into potential evidence for expanded prosecution. Family members avoid contact to prevent becoming targets of investigation that spreads through social networks like infectious disease, consuming everyone connected to people who challenge federal authority. But anonymous legal assistance begins arriving through channels that avoid normal monitoring. Perfect legal briefs appear in her cell through guard networks that operate according to rules that have nothing to do with official procedures. Constitutional law materials with recent annotations suggest professional legal support from sources that remain carefully hidden. Judge Thornwick Sterling's courtroom occupies prime real estate in downtown federal building that projects authority through architectural intimidation designed to remind defendants that federal power dwarfs any possible resistance. The judge himself embodies judicial authority combined with personal bias that has shaped federal prosecution for 15 years on the bench. Sterling's reputation includes systematic patterns of harsh sentencing for minority defendants, creative interpretation of federal guidelines that maximize punishment for people who challenge systems designed to exclude them from prosperity, and close relationships with prosecutors who provide him with cases that allow expression of prejudices disguised as legal reasoning. Ms. Kellens, Sterling begins, his voice carrying condescension refined through decades of wielding federal authority against people who lack resources to challenge judicial misconduct. You have chosen to represent yourself in complex federal litigation. I trust you understand the gravity of proceeding without counsel. The warning sounds judicial but contains threat that pro-se representation will receive no accommodation for unfamiliarity with federal procedures that favor prosecutors who work in Sterling's courtroom daily. Self-representation becomes evidence of mental instability or criminal arrogance, either of which justifies additional punishment. I understand my constitutional right to counsel, Your Honor, Zara responds, her voice carrying none of the deference that federal judges expect from defendants who lack Harvard law degrees and family connections to federal judicial networks. I also understand my right to represent myself if I choose to do so. Sterling's expression tightens at the mention of constitutional rights, which federal judges often interpret as code language for civil rights litigation that threatens comfortable arrangements between prosecution and judicial authority. Constitutional rights become suspicious when claimed by defendants who lack proper social credentials. This woman's dignity under attack is breaking my heart. If you're feeling this too, smash that like button to show support for everyone who's faced this kind of discrimination. Share this story. Someone needs to see they're not alone in this fight. The jury selection process reveals systematic exclusion of minority jurors through challenges that sound race-neutral but achieve segregated results with mathematical precision. Prosecutor Corset exercises peremptory challenges against every black potential juror, while Sterling sustains objections to defense challenges of white jurors who express obvious bias. Your Honor, Zara objects during voir dire, the prosecution has used 9 of 12 peremptory challenges to exclude African American jurors. This creates a pattern of racial discrimination prohibited by Batson versus Kentucky. The objection cites federal precedent with precision that surprises courtroom observers familiar with pro se defendants who typically lack familiarity with constitutional law. Sterling's response reveals annoyance at being challenged on legal grounds by someone he assumes lacks authority to question federal judicial procedures. Counselor, Sterling responds, emphasizing the title with sarcasm that suggests legal representation requires official credentials rather than constitutional knowledge. The prosecution's challenges appear race-neutral on their face. Your objection is overruled. The race-neutral explanations include eliminating jurors for being too educated, when education means community college degrees, potentially biased, when bias means living in neighborhoods affected by federal prosecution, and unsuitable temperament, when temperament means questioning authority that demands unquestioning obedience. The final jury composition includes 11 white members and 1 Asian American alternate, who will be dismissed before deliberation begins. The systematic exclusion of minority perspectives ensures conviction probability that federal prosecutors consider standard operating procedure in cases involving defendants who challenge systems designed to exclude them from prosperity. Opening statements begin with Corset's presentation that transforms legitimate home ownership into federal conspiracy through narrative techniques that assume criminality and require defendants to prove innocence through resources they cannot access. His voice carries prosecutorial authority that federal judges recognize as professional competence. Ladies and gentlemen of the jury, Corset begins, referring to prepared notes that describe normal financial transactions in language designed to suggest criminal sophistication. The defendant stands before you accused of deliberately defrauding federal programs designed to help legitimate homebuyers achieve the American dream. The American dream language conceals systematic exclusion that prevents minority homeownership through lending discrimination, zoning restrictions, and federal prosecution of people who achieve success despite institutional barriers designed to maintain segregated prosperity. Legitimate homebuyers means white homebuyers in prosecutorial vocabulary. The evidence will show, Corset continues, a complex scheme involving false income reporting, document manipulation, and coordination with known fraud networks to secure housing benefits for which the defendant was not entitled. The complex scheme consists of buying a house with documented legal income through legitimate lending procedures that federal investigators have reinterpreted as criminal conspiracy. The known fraud networks remain unnamed because they exist only in prosecutorial imagination that treats professional success as evidence of criminal association. Zara's opening statement addresses the jury with confidence that suggests either naivety about federal court procedures or professional familiarity with constitutional litigation that exceeds normal legal education. Her voice carries none of the deference that federal judges expect from pro se defendants facing federal conspiracy charges. Members of the jury, she begins, organizing documents with precision that suggests systematic legal training rather than desperate preparation by someone facing federal prison. The government's case relies on transforming normal homeownership into federal crime through creative interpretation of legitimate financial transactions. The document organization follows patterns used by federal litigators who understand that evidence presentation requires systematic approach to complex factual records. Her citations reference federal rules of evidence with ease that criminal defendants rarely display without extensive legal education. Every financial transaction in this case was legal, documented, and reported according to federal requirements, and Donaldson, she continues, displaying bank records that support legal homeownership rather than criminal conspiracy. The government has manufactured federal charges from activities that millions of Americans engage in daily without criminal consequences. The defense strategy reveals unusual sophistication in federal constitutional law, particularly civil rights enforcement and prosecutorial misconduct remedies that suggest academic or professional expertise beyond normal legal education. Her cross-examination plans cite federal precedents that most criminal defense attorneys would need research to identify. Judge Sterling's courtroom management reveals bias that becomes increasingly obvious as trial proceeds through testimony designed to convict regardless of underlying evidence. His rulings favor prosecution objections while sustaining government arguments that transform constitutional protections into obstacles to federal conviction. Sustained, Sterling responds to prosecution objections before Zara completes questions that might reveal prosecutorial misconduct or federal agency coordination. His pattern establishes judicial predisposition that treats defense challenges as waste of court time rather than constitutional requirements. Government witnesses include federal agents who describe normal homeownership through language that suggests criminal conspiracy, banking officials who interpret legitimate transactions as money laundering, and housing authority personnel who transform regulatory compliance into evidence of systematic fraud. Agent Crawford's testimony describes federal investigation with professional authority that conceals systematic constitutional violations behind bureaucratic language designed to sound objective while achieving predetermined results. His voice carries federal credibility that juries associate with professional competence. Our investigation revealed patterns consistent with organized housing fraud, Crawford testifies, referring to notes that describe legal home ownership in language borrowed from actual criminal prosecutions. The defendant's financial transactions displayed sophistication that suggested coordination with criminal networks. The sophistication consists of organizing bank records chronologically and maintaining documentation that supports legal home ownership. The criminal networks remain unidentified because they exist only in federal imagination that treats professional organization as evidence of criminal conspiracy. Cross-examination reveals Crawford's unfamiliarity with actual evidence beyond summary reports prepared by other agents who relied on housing authority allegations that transformed compliance questions into federal criminal referrals. His testimony crumbles under questioning that displays unusual expertise in federal investigation procedures. Agent Crawford, Zara begins, consulting notes that demonstrate systematic preparation beyond typical pro se defendant capabilities. Your investigation report indicates coordination with housing authority fraud investigators. Can you identify specific evidence of fraud beyond their initial allegations? The question reveals understanding of federal investigation procedures that criminal defendants rarely possess without extensive legal education. Crawford's response demonstrates unfamiliarity with underlying evidence beyond summary reports that assumed criminal activity and worked backward to construct supporting narrative. The investigation was comprehensive. Crawford responds with bureaucratic language that avoids admitting federal agents accepted housing authority allegations without independent verification and followed standard federal procedures for complex financial fraud cases. Standard federal procedures require independent verification of allegations before initiating federal prosecution, Zara responds, citing federal criminal investigation guidelines with precision that suggests professional familiarity with federal law enforcement. Can you identify independent evidence that supports federal charges beyond housing authority referrals? The question reveals expertise that surprises courtroom observers familiar with pro se defendants who typically lack knowledge of federal investigation requirements. Sterling's interruption demonstrates judicial bias designed to protect prosecution from constitutional challenges that might reveal federal misconduct. Ms. Kellens, Sterling interjects, his voice carrying judicial authority designed to terminate questioning that threatens prosecution case. Please limit your questions to matters directly relevant to the charges. The limitation prevents exploration of prosecutorial misconduct that might reveal systematic federal violations disguised as legitimate law enforcement. Constitutional challenges become irrelevant when federal judges prioritize conviction over constitutional compliance. Housing authority testimony includes Gage Whitmore's explanation of fraud investigation that transformed regulatory questions into federal criminal referrals without identifying actual evidence of criminal activity beyond successful minority homeownership in gentrifying neighborhoods that prefer segregated prosperity. Ms. Kellens' application raised red flags, Whitmore testifies, referring to notes that describe legitimate income verification as suspicious activity that suggested possible coordination with fraud networks known to target federal housing programs. The red flags consist of being black and successful in neighborhoods that associate black success with criminal activity. The fraud networks remain unnamed because they exist only in housing authority imagination that treats minority achievement as presumptive evidence of criminal conspiracy. Our investigation revealed discrepancies, Whitmore continues, between reported income and lifestyle that suggested undisclosed financial resources consistent with criminal activity. The discrepancies consist of buying a house that housing authority officials believe exceeds appropriate Black aspirations. The undisclosed financial resources include inheritance funds and life insurance proceeds that were fully reported and documented according to federal requirements. Cross-examination reveals Whitmore's unfamiliarity with federal housing law beyond basic administrative procedures that he has interpreted creatively to manufacture criminal referrals from legitimate homeownership applications that threaten segregated community demographics. Mr. Whitmore, Zara begins, consulting Federal Housing Administration guidelines with ease that suggests professional familiarity with housing law. Can you cite specific FHA regulations that prohibit homeownership based on inheritance funds and life insurance proceeds? The question demonstrates expertise in federal housing law that housing authority officials rarely encounter from homeowners who typically lack legal education necessary to challenge administrative decisions disguised as criminal investigations. The regulations are complex, Whitmore responds, avoiding admission that federal housing law explicitly permits homeownership through inheritance and insurance proceeds that Zara reported according to federal requirements, and require interpretation based on overall patterns rather than individual transactions. Federal regulations provide specific guidance for inheritance and insurance proceeds, Zara responds, citing Title 24 Code of Federal Regulations with precision that suggests professional legal education. Can you identify specific language that classifies my documented financial sources as prohibited? The questioning reveals systematic housing authority ignorance of federal law combined with racial bias that transforms legitimate minority achievement into presumptive criminal activity. Whitmore's inability to cite relevant regulations demonstrates that federal prosecution relies on prejudice rather than legal authority. Banking testimony includes officials who describe legitimate financial transactions through language that suggests money laundering based on patterns that millions of Americans display without criminal consequences. Their testimony reveals institutional bias that treats Black banking success as inherently suspicious. The defendant's banking patterns displayed characteristics consistent with money laundering, testifies Bank Supervisor Reynolds, referring to federal guidelines that describe normal electronic banking as potentially suspicious when conducted by people who lack appropriate social credentials. The characteristics include regular deposits from consulting income and electronic transfers for mortgage payments, utilities, and basic living expenses that constitute normal financial management for homeowners throughout America who avoid criminal prosecution because they possess appropriate racial credentials. Cross-examination reveals banking officials' unfamiliarity with money laundering law beyond federal reporting requirement that they have interpreted creatively to support federal prosecution based on racial biases rather than actual criminal activity. Mr. Esther Reynolds, Zara begins, consulting Bank Secrecy Act requirements with expertise that suggests professional familiarity with federal banking law. Can you identify specific BSA violations in my banking records beyond normal electronic transactions? The question demonstrates knowledge of federal banking regulations that bank officials rarely encounter from customers who typically lack legal expertise necessary to challenge institutional bias disguised as fraud prevention procedures. Prosecution evidence includes surveillance materials that describe normal homeownership activities through language that suggests criminal conspiracy based on federal interpretation that treats Black success as presumptive evidence of illegal activity requiring extensive investigation. Federal surveillance reports describe frequent visitors that consist of friends and family members engaging in social activities that homeownership traditionally provides. Unusual financial activity includes paying bills electronically and maintaining organized financial records that suggest either criminal sophistication or normal responsible behavior. Document analysis reveals federal agents' systematic reinterpretation of legal activity through investigative procedures that assume criminality and work backward to construct supporting evidence from legitimate transactions that millions of Americans conduct without federal scrutiny. The evidence establishes beyond reasonable doubt, Corset argues during closing arguments, that the defendant engaged in systematic fraud to obtain housing benefits through criminal deception designed to circumvent federal programs intended for legitimate applicants. The systematic fraud consists of buying a house legally with documented income through legitimate lending procedures. The criminal deception involves being Black and successful in systems designed to exclude minority homeownership from neighborhoods that maintain segregated prosperity through federal prosecution. The legitimate applicant's language conceals systematic discrimination that treats Black homeownership as inherently illegitimate regardless of financial qualification or legal compliance. Federal programs become weapons for maintaining segregation through criminal prosecution disguised as fraud prevention. Defense closing arguments address systematic prosecutorial misconduct disguised as law enforcement, judicial bias that prevents constitutional challenges, and federal agency coordination designed to manufacture criminal cases from legitimate home ownership that threatens established exclusion patterns. The government has failed to present evidence of actual fraud, Zara argues, organizing materials with precision that suggests professional litigation experience beyond typical pro se defendant capabilities. Because no fraud occurred, every financial transaction was legal, documented, and reported according to federal requirements. The argument reveals sophisticated understanding of constitutional law and federal prosecution standards that criminal defendants rarely possess without extensive legal education. Her presentation follows patterns used by civil rights attorneys who specialize in federal constitutional litigation. This prosecution represents systematic abuse of federal authority, she continues, citing constitutional precedents with ease that suggests professional familiarity with civil rights enforcement, designed to punish legitimate achievement and deter minority home ownership through criminal process rather than legal authority. The constitutional challenges reveal expertise that exceeds normal legal education and suggests professional experience in federal civil rights litigation that remains carefully concealed behind pro se representation that conceals professional identity for reasons that will become clear. Jury deliberation occurs in circumstances designed to achieve conviction through intimidation rather than evidence evaluation. Federal courtroom procedures emphasize prosecution authority while minimizing defense challenges that might reveal systematic constitutional violations disguised as legitimate law enforcement. The verdict arrives after deliberation that lasts less than 4 hours because federal juries understand that conviction is expected regardless of underlying evidence when defendants lack resources to challenge prosecutorial narrative through constitutional protections that federal judges routinely ignore. "We the jury find the defendant guilty on all counts," announces the jury foreman, his voice carrying reluctance that suggests understanding that federal conviction serves purposes beyond actual justice. The verdict echoes through courtroom, where federal authority demonstrates its power to destroy lives through legal process that maintains constitutional appearance while achieving unconstitutional results. Sentencing proceedings occur 3 weeks later in Sterling's courtroom that projects federal authority through architectural intimidation designed to emphasize judicial power over people who challenge systems designed to exclude them from prosperity through prosecution disguised as crime prevention. "Ms. Kellens," Sterling begins, his voice carrying judicial satisfaction at successful prosecution of someone who dared challenge federal authority through constitutional claims that federal judges prefer to ignore. "You have been convicted of serious federal crimes that strike at the heart of programs designed to help legitimate homebuyers. The sentencing guidelines suggest 15 to 25 years federal imprisonment for first-time housing offense that most federal judges would recognize as prosecutorial overreach if committed against defendants with appropriate social credentials and financial resources. But Sterling's reputation includes systematic harsh sentencing for minority defendants who challenge federal authority through constitutional claims that threaten comfortable arrangements between prosecution and judicial power that prefers conviction to constitutional compliance. However," Sterling continues, pausing for effect that demonstrates judicial power over human lives, "that federal authority can destroy through legal process regardless of underlying innocence. Before I impose sentence, do you wish to make any statement to the court?" The question provides opportunity for allocution that federal judges expect will include admission of guilt and request for mercy that acknowledges judicial authority and prosecutorial wisdom in pursuing federal charges against people who lack appropriate credentials. Zara stands at defendant table with posture that suggests either resignation or preparation for revelation that will transform these proceedings in ways that Sterling cannot anticipate. Her hands rest on documents that she has organized with systematic precision that suggests professional familiarity with federal litigation procedures. "Your Honor," she begins, her voice carrying none of the deference that federal judges expect from convicted defendants facing federal imprisonment, "I have something the court needs to see before sentencing proceeds. Cases like this show why you need identity protection. LifeLock monitors your personal information and alerts you to potential fraud before it ruins your life. With millions of Americans affected by identity theft each year, protection isn't optional. Go to lifelock.com/protect and use code DEFEND for 20% off your first year. Your financial security is worth it. The document emerges from her briefcase with deliberate precision that suggests this moment has been anticipated through months of careful preparation. Federal credentials that carry authority beyond any state or local jurisdiction, beyond any federal district court, beyond any power that Sterling has wielded against people who lack constitutional protection. The badge reflects courtroom lighting as it establishes authority that supersedes every assumption about defendants who represent themselves in federal court because they lack resources for adequate legal counsel. Federal Bureau of Investigation, Special Agent, Civil Rights Division. Sterling's expression cycles through confusion, recognition, and something approaching panic as understanding penetrates judicial arrogance that has operated without federal oversight for 15 years of systematic constitutional violations disguised as legitimate judicial authority. Special Agent Zara Kellen, she announces, her voice carrying federal authority that transforms these proceedings from criminal prosecution to federal civil rights investigation that has documented systematic constitutional violations through undercover operation designed to expose judicial corruption. Federal Bureau of Investigation Civil Rights Division. This court is now under federal investigation for systematic violations of constitutional rights under color of law. Hold up, something's not adding up here. Hit that notification bell because you're about to witness the most incredible identity reveal in legal history. The next 10 minutes will change everything you thought you knew about this case. The courtroom erupts into chaos that federal authority has finally imposed on systems that believe themselves immune from constitutional accountability. Sterling's gavel pounds uselessly against judicial bench that no longer projects authority over federal investigation that has documented months of systematic constitutional violations. Prosecutor Corset sits frozen at government table as understanding penetrates prosecutorial confidence that federal conviction represents professional achievement rather than systematic constitutional violation that federal oversight has documented through undercover operation designed to expose prosecution misconduct. Want to understand your constitutional rights? Masterclass offers courses by legal experts who break down complex law into simple terms. Learn how the justice system really works from former prosecutors, defense attorneys, and civil rights advocates. Visit masterclass.com/law for 50% off annual memberships. Knowledge is your best legal defense. The revelation transforms everything that has occurred through months of systematic constitutional violations into federal evidence that will support civil rights prosecution against judicial and prosecutorial officials who believed federal authority would protect their systematic abuse of constitutional protections. But this transformation represents only the beginning of federal investigation that extends beyond Sterling's courtroom into systematic patterns of constitutional violations that federal civil rights enforcement has documented through undercover operations designed to expose institutional corruption disguised as legitimate law enforcement. The next phase of this federal investigation will reveal connections that extend throughout federal district courts where constitutional violations operate as standard procedure against defendants who lack resources to challenge systematic abuse of federal authority disguised as legitimate prosecution. And Special Agent Zara Kellens has documented everything. The federal credentials rest on the defense table like evidence of a crime that nobody in this courtroom saw coming. Special Agent Badge Number 7491, issued by the Federal Bureau of Investigation Civil Rights Division, Washington, D.C. The metal catches fluorescent lighting and throws it back in fragments that seem to blind everyone who thought they understood what was happening in Judge Sterling's carefully controlled domain. Court reporter Quinlan Meyer's fingers freeze above her stenotype machine. The mechanical rhythm that has recorded thousands of federal proceedings suddenly silent as she processes that everything she has transcribed for the past 6 months represents federal evidence in a civil rights investigation that has documented systematic constitutional violations from the inside. This court is under federal investigation, Zara continues, her voice carrying authority that transforms the judicial hierarchy that Sterling has wielded for 15 years into something as fragile as morning frost. For systematic violations of civil rights under color of federal law, conspiracy to deprive citizens of constitutional protections, and abuse of federal judicial authority in violation of Title 18 United States Code Section 242. The statute citation rolls off her tongue with the precision of someone who has spent 18 months documenting every violation, every procedural abuse, every moment when federal authority was weaponized against citizens whose only crime involved challenging systems designed to exclude them from prosperity. Sterling's face cycles through expressions that suggest a man watching his carefully constructed world collapse in real time. The gavel in his hand trembles slightly. Federal judicial authority suddenly revealed as nothing more than wood and metal when confronted with federal oversight that he believed would never reach his courtroom. This is highly irregular, irregular, he manages, his voice carrying none of the commanding presence that has intimidated defendants and attorneys for over a decade. I demand to see federal authorization for this theatrical display. Your Honor, Zara responds, though the title now carries entirely different meaning when directed at someone who has become subject of federal criminal investigation rather than arbiter of federal justice. I direct your attention to the gallery where you'll find Special Agent Rebecca Morrison, my handler for this operation, and Assistant Director Marcus Williams from the FBI's Civil Rights Division. The gallery transforms as people who had been observing these proceedings as courtroom spectators reveal themselves as federal investigators who have been documenting constitutional violations through systematic observation that captured every procedural abuse, every biased ruling, every moment when federal judicial authority served racial prejudice rather than constitutional law. Special Agent Morrison rises from her seat in the third row, displaying credentials that carry federal authority beyond anything Sterling can challenge through judicial procedures. Her presence explains the perfect legal briefs, the impossible constitutional expertise, the systematic preparation that suggested professional support beyond what pro se defendants could possibly access. Federal Bureau of Investigation, Morrison announces, her voice carrying across a courtroom that has become crime scene rather than temple of justice. This court has been under federal surveillance as part of Operation Justice Denied, a comprehensive civil rights investigation into systematic constitutional violations in federal district courts. Assistant Director Williams approaches from the back of the gallery, his movement causing security personnel to step aside with the automatic deference that federal authority commands when properly displayed. His presence suggests that this investigation extends far beyond Sterling's courtroom into institutional patterns that have operated without accountability until federal oversight decided to document everything. Agent Kellens has been operating undercover for 18 months, Williams explains, referring to documentation that transforms every ruling, every procedural decision, every moment of judicial bias into federal evidence that will support criminal prosecution. During that time, she has documented systematic patterns of civil rights violations affecting over 400 federal defendants. 400 defendants. The number echoes through courtroom silence as everyone processes the scope of constitutional violations that federal investigation has documented through systematic observation that captured institutional racism disguised as legitimate judicial authority. Prosecutor Corsett remains frozen at government table, his expensive suit suddenly appearing as costume for someone who has been performing federal authority while actually committing federal crimes under color of law. His prosecution of Zara represents just one case in systematic patterns of constitutional violations that federal civil rights enforcement has documented through undercover operation. Mr. Corsett, Agent Morrison continues, producing arrest warrant that carries federal authority. You are under arrest for conspiracy to violate civil rights under color of law, deprivation of constitutional rights under federal jurisdiction, and criminal conspiracy to abuse federal prosecutorial authority. The Miranda rights echo through chambers designed to project federal power over defendants who lack constitutional protection, now applied to prosecutors who believed federal authority would shield their systematic abuse of constitutional guarantees. The symmetry carries poetic justice that transforms Sterling's courtroom into federal crime scene. Federal marshals materialize from positions throughout the courthouse, their presence suggesting coordination that extends beyond this single courtroom into systematic federal operation designed to address institutional corruption that has operated without oversight for years. Their badges reflect lighting in ways that emphasize federal authority over local power structures. Judge Sterling, Williams addresses judicial authority that no longer commands respect in chambers where constitutional violations have been documented through systematic federal investigation. Federal grand jury has issued sealed indictments charging you with systematic civil rights violations, abuse of federal judicial authority, and criminal conspiracy to deny constitutional protections. The sealed indictments suggest investigation that extends beyond what anyone in this courtroom understood was occurring. Federal oversight that documented constitutional violations through methods that Sterling never suspected could penetrate judicial immunity that he believed protected systematic abuse of federal authority. Sterling's arrest occurs in his own courtroom, federal handcuffs clicking into place with mechanical precision that ends 15 years of systematic constitutional violations disguised as legitimate judicial authority. The image will appear on evening news broadcasts with headlines about federal judges who forgot that constitutional protections apply to everyone. This investigation began Agent Kellens explains to courtroom filled with reporters, attorneys, and civil rights advocates who understand they are witnessing historic moment when federal oversight finally addressed systematic institutional corruption, when patterns analysis revealed statistical impossibilities in conviction rates, sentencing disparities, and procedural violations. The statistical analysis revealed that Sterling's courtroom convicted minority defendants at rates that exceeded federal averages by margins that suggested systematic bias rather than legitimate judicial authority. Sentencing disparities showed racial patterns that violated constitutional equal protection through systematic application of judicial discretion. Federal civil rights enforcement identified this district as high priority, she continues, consulting federal investigation materials that documented every constitutional violation through systematic surveillance that captured institutional racism in operation, based on civil rights complaints, appellate reversals, and community reports of systematic discrimination. The community reports came from families like Maria Santos's clients, people who faced federal prosecution for crimes that existed only in prosecutorial imagination, that treated minority success as presumptive evidence of criminal activity requiring federal investigation and prosecution. Housing Authority. Director Gage Whitmore receives arrests simultaneously at his office across downtown Los Angeles. Federal agents executing search warrant that reveals systematic coordination between housing officials and federal prosecutors to manufacture criminal cases from legitimate homeownership applications that threaten segregated community demographics. The search discovers email communications between Whitmore and Sterling's chambers, coordination that planned prosecutions before investigations occurred, systematic abuse of federal authority to maintain segregated prosperity through criminal prosecution disguised as fraud prevention. The evidence includes, Agent Morrison explains to media representatives who understand they are covering federal civil rights investigation of historic significance, over 12,000 hours of digital surveillance, 400 documented constitutional violations, and systematic patterns of institutional racism operating under color of federal law. 12,000 hours represents systematic documentation that captured constitutional violations in real time. Federal evidence that will support criminal prosecution of judicial and prosecutorial officials who believed federal immunity protected systematic abuse of constitutional guarantees that apply to every American citizen. Court reporter Myers faces federal charges for systematic alteration of transcripts that concealed constitutional violations, evidence tampering that protected institutional corruption through falsification of official records that documented federal proceedings inaccurately to shield systematic abuse from appellate review. Federal investigation revealed, Williams continues, systematic transcript alterations affecting over 200 federal cases, evidence tampering designed to conceal constitutional violations from appellate courts and federal oversight agencies. 200 cases represent systematic institutionalized corruption that operated through coordination between judicial, prosecutorial, and administrative personnel who understood that federal authority could be weaponized against people who lacked resources to challenge constitutional violations through appellate procedures. The Bailiff Network receives federal scrutiny for systematic intimidation of defendants, families, and witnesses who challenged federal authority through constitutional claims. Federal investigation documented harassment patterns that extended beyond courthouse walls into community intimidation designed to discourage civil rights complaints. Emergency federal oversight arrives within hours of arrests. Department of Justice Civil Rights Division assuming administrative control of Sterling's docket pending federal investigation completion. Federal monitors will review every pending case for constitutional violations that require dismissal or procedural remediation. Immediate relief includes, announces DOJ Civil Rights Attorney Sloan Carmichael, dismissal of charges in cases involving prosecutorial misconduct, sentence review for defendants affected by systematic bias, and comprehensive case-by-case evaluation of constitutional violations requiring federal remediation. Federal remediation extends beyond individual cases to institutional reforms that address systematic patterns of constitutional violations. New protocols require federal oversight of judicial decisions, prosecutorial charging decisions, and court administrative procedures that affect constitutional protections. Congressional oversight begins immediately as House Judiciary Committee announces federal hearings into systematic constitutional violation in federal district courts. Federal investigation scope expands to examine institutional patterns that extend beyond Los Angeles into systematic problems affecting federal judicial authority nationwide. This investigation, announces Congressman David Martinez, chairman of House Judiciary Civil Rights Subcommittee, represents federal commitment to ensuring that constitutional protections apply equally, regardless of race, economic status, or social credentials that some federal officials apparently believe determine who deserves constitutional rights. The congressional hearings will examine federal judicial selection processes, prosecutorial accountability mechanisms, and oversight procedures that failed to identify systematic constitutional violations operating for years without federal intervention. Institutional reforms will address systematic problems that enabled constitutional violations. Justice served, but this is just the beginning. Subscribe now because next week's story involves a corrupt sheriff who thought he was untouchable until he messed with the wrong federal prosecutor. You don't want to miss that takedown. Federal grand jury proceedings occur under seal that protects ongoing investigation while federal prosecutors build criminal cases against judicial and prosecutorial officials who systematically violated constitutional rights through abuse of federal authority disguised as legitimate law enforcement. The grand jury evidence includes systematic documentation of constitutional violations, statistical analysis proving racial bias, recorded conversations revealing coordination between officials, and testimony from federal investigators who observed constitutional violations through undercover operation designed to document institutional corruption. Special Agent Kellens testifies before grand jury about systematic constitutional violations she documented through 18 months of undercover operation that captured institutional racism in real time. Her testimony provides firsthand evidence of judicial bias, prosecutorial misconduct, and administrative corruption operating as systematic institutional practice. The systematic nature of constitutional violations, she explains to grand jurors who understand they are reviewing evidence of institutional corruption that operated without accountability for years, created hostile environment for federal defendants who exercised constitutional rights that federal officials treated as evidence of criminal sophistication. Federal indictments emerge after grand jury deliberation that examined evidence of systematic constitutional violations affecting hundreds of federal defendants who faced prosecution in Sterling's courtroom, where constitutional protections operated as legal theory rather than enforceable rights. Judge Sterling faces federal charges including conspiracy to violate civil rights under color of law, systematic deprivation of constitutional rights, obstruction of federal civil rights enforcement, and criminal abuse of federal judicial authority. Federal sentencing guidelines suggest 15 to 20 years imprisonment. Prosecutor Corsett receives federal charges including systematic prosecutorial misconduct, conspiracy to deny constitutional rights, federal civil rights violations, and obstruction of justice through systematic abuse of federal prosecutorial authority. Federal guidelines recommend 12 to 18 years imprisonment. Housing Director Whitmore faces charges of conspiracy to violate federal housing laws, systematic discrimination in federal program administration, civil rights violations under color of federal authority, and criminal coordination with federal officials to deny constitutional protections through fraudulent prosecutions. The federal trials occur in different district court to avoid institutional bias that federal investigation documented in Sterling's jurisdiction. Federal judges from other districts will preside over proceedings that examine systematic constitutional violations operating as institutional practice rather than isolated incidents. Defense attorneys for Sterling, Corsett, and other federal defendants argue that institutional practices represented standard procedures rather than criminal conspiracy, that constitutional violations resulted from judicial discretion rather than systematic bias, that federal prosecution represents overreach into legitimate judicial authority. But federal evidence includes statistical analysis proving systematic racial bias, recorded conversations revealing deliberate coordination to deny constitutional rights, testimony from defendants who suffered constitutional violations, and expert analysis demonstrating that patterns exceeded probability of random occurrence. The evidence demonstrates, federal prosecutor Maria Rodriguez explains to jury examining systematic constitutional violations, deliberate coordinated abuse of federal authority designed to deny constitutional rights based on racial biases disguised as legitimate law enforcement. Federal conviction rates in civil rights prosecutions exceed 90% when evidence includes systematic documentation of constitutional violations. Sterling, Corsett, and other federal defendants face overwhelming evidence that federal investigation documented through methods they never suspected could penetrate institutional immunity. Sterling receives federal sentence of 18 years imprisonment, loss of federal judicial pension, permanent disbarment from legal practice, and lifetime prohibition from federal employment. Federal judge emphasizes that systematic constitutional violations require severe punishment to deter institutional corruption. Your systematic abuse of federal judicial authority, sentencing judge explains, represents betrayal of constitutional oath that demands accountability commensurate with institutional trust that you violated through systematic racial bias disguised as legitimate judicial authority. Corset receives 15 years federal imprisonment, loss of prosecutorial license, federal civil penalties, and permanent exclusion from federal legal practice. Federal sentencing emphasizes that prosecutorial misconduct threatens constitutional foundation that requires protection through severe criminal penalties. Federal civil litigation follows criminal convictions as hundreds of defendants affected by systematic constitutional violations file federal civil rights lawsuits seeking compensation for constitutional violations that federal investigation documented through systematic evidence gathering. Civil settlements reach hundreds of millions of dollars as federal government accepts liability for systematic constitutional violations that federal oversight failed to identify, despite statistical evidence that should have triggered federal intervention years earlier. Federal civil rights settlements, explains civil rights attorney Jonathan Walker, acknowledge systematic institutional failure that enabled constitutional violations affecting hundreds of federal defendants who suffered criminal prosecution based on racial bias as rather than legitimate law enforcement. Institutional reforms implemented through federal consent decree require systematic changes in judicial selection, prosecutorial oversight, court administration, and federal monitoring that address systematic problems enabling constitutional violations to operate without accountability. Federal monitoring includes real-time statistical analysis of judicial decisions, prosecutorial charging patterns, sentencing disparities, and procedural violations that will trigger immediate federal intervention when patterns suggest systematic constitutional violations resuming operation. Comprehensive federal oversight, announces DOJ Civil Rights Director Patricia Williams, ensures that constitutional protections operate as enforceable rights rather than theoretical guarantees that federal officials can violate without accountability when defendants lack resources to challenge systematic institutional bias. Special Agent Kellens receives federal commendation for undercover operation that exposed systematic constitutional violations affecting thousands of federal defendants who faced prosecution in courts where racial bias operated as institutional practice disguised as legitimate judicial authority. Agent Kellens demonstrated extraordinary dedication, FBI Director Christopher Hayes announces during federal award ceremony, to constitutional principles that she protected through personal sacrifice and professional excellence that exemplifies federal law enforcement commitment to civil rights protection. The federal investigation expands to examine systematic patterns in other federal district courts where statistical analysis suggests similar constitutional violations operating without federal oversight. Operation Justice Denied becomes comprehensive federal civil rights initiative examining institutional racism in federal judicial system. Systematic constitutional violations, announces Attorney General Lisa Thompson, require comprehensive federal response that addresses institutional patterns rather than isolated incidents. Federal civil rights enforcement will examine every district court where statistical evidence suggests systematic bias affecting constitutional protections. Community impact includes federal civil rights education programs, constitutional awareness training, legal aid expansion, and community oversight mechanisms that provide federal protection for civil rights complaints that local authorities might ignore or suppress through institutional coordination. Jamal Kamar Youth Justice Center expands programming to include federal civil rights education, constitutional law training, and community organizing that empowers neighborhoods to identify and report systematic constitutional violations before they achieve institutional entrenchment that requires federal investigation. Federal civil rights protection, explains community organizer Rosa Martinez, requires community participation that identifies systematic violations early enough for federal intervention to prevent institutional corruption from achieving systematic operation that affects hundreds of people. Federal judicial reforms include systematic bias training, constitutional compliance monitoring, sentencing disparity analysis, and accountability mechanisms that prevent systematic constitutional violations from operating without immediate federal intervention and institutional remediation. Congressional legislation strengthens federal civil rights enforcement through expanded investigation authority, mandatory reporting requirements, systematic statistical monitoring, and community complaint mechanisms that provide federal oversight of judicial and prosecutorial authority at local levels. Federal civil rights legislation, Maysenimam explains Congressman Martinez Emansantiamanas creates systematic accountability that prevents constitutional violations from achieving institutional protection through political coordination that shields systematic bias from federal oversight and community challenge. Federal court monitoring reveals systematic improvements in constitutional compliance as judicial and prosecutorial officials understand that federal oversight now operates as permanent institutional feature rather than temporary investigation that can be waited out through political influence. Statistical analysis shows dramatic reduction in racial sentencing disparities, constitutional violations, procedural abuse, and systematic bias patterns that federal monitoring prevents from achieving institutional entrenchment through real-time federal intervention and accountability. Federal oversight demonstrates, reports Federal Judicial Statistics Commission, that systematic constitutional violations require permanent monitoring rather than periodic investigation. Real-time federal intervention prevents institutional bias from resuming operation when temporary oversight ends. 3 years after Sterling's conviction, federal civil rights protection operates as systematic institutional feature that provides constitutional accountability through permanent federal oversight rather than crisis response to systematic violations that achieve institutional entrenchment before federal intervention. Agent Kellens transitions to federal civil rights training position that prepares federal investigators for undercover operations in institutional settings, where systematic constitutional violations operate as standard practice disguised as legitimate authority. Undercover civil rights investigation, she explains to Federal Training Academy students, requires understanding that institutional corruption operates through systematic coordination rather than individual criminal activity. Federal investigation must document systematic patterns that prove institutional conspiracy. Federal civil rights enforcement expands to examine systematic patterns in immigration courts, military tribunals, administrative proceedings, and federal agency operations where constitutional violations might operate without adequate federal oversight or community accountability mechanisms. Constitutional protections, emphasizes federal civil rights training curriculum, require systematic enforcement that identifies institutional patterns before they achieve systematic operation affecting large populations who lack resources to challenge federal authority through individual constitutional claims. Community organizing strengthens through federal civil rights education that empowers neighborhoods to identify systematic constitutional violations, document institutional bias, and coordinate with federal civil rights enforcement to prevent systematic abuse from achieving institutional protection. Federal legislation creates permanent community oversight councils with federal authority to investigate constitutional complaints, coordinate with federal civil rights enforcement, and provide systematic accountability for judicial and prosecutorial authority that affects constitutional protections. Community federal oversight, explains legislation sponsor Senator Angela Davis, creates systematic accountability that operates independently of political influence or institutional coordination that might shield constitutional violations from federal investigation and community challenge. But systematic institutional change requires generational commitment that extends beyond individual prosecutions or temporary federal oversight. Constitutional protections depend on permanent vigilance that identifies systematic bias before it achieves institutional entrenchment that affects thousands of people. Federal monitoring reveals emerging patterns in other jurisdictions where systematic constitutional violations begin developing through coordination between judicial, prosecutorial, and administrative officials who believe federal oversight focuses only on high-profile cases rather than systematic institutional patterns. Systematic constitutional violations bots, warns Federal Civil Rights Quarterly Report. Resume operation through adaptive institutional coordination that attempts to avoid federal detection while achieving systematic bias through subtle procedural manipulation that requires sophisticated federal monitoring. Federal investigation discovers systematic coordination between multiple federal district courts designed to share information about federal civil rights monitoring, coordinate constitutional violation patterns that avoid statistical detection, and maintain systematic bias through inter-district cooperation. Multi-district constitutional violations, announces Federal Civil Rights Task Force, require comprehensive federal response that addresses institutional coordination rather than isolated jurisdictional problems. Federal oversight must examine systematic patterns that transcend individual court administration. The revelation suggests systematic institutional resistance to federal civil rights enforcement that operates through coordination designed to circumvent federal monitoring while maintaining systematic constitutional violations through adaptive institutional practices. Special Agent Kellens receives assignment to lead federal task force investigating multi-district constitutional violations that operate through systematic coordination designed to maintain institutional bias while avoiding federal detection through statistical manipulation. Advanced institutional corruption, she explains to Congressional Oversight Committee, requires federal investigation that understands systematic adaptation designed to circumvent federal monitoring while maintaining constitutional violations through coordination that appears legitimate but achieves systematic bias. Federal investigation scope expands to examine systematic patterns affecting immigration enforcement, federal agency administration, military justice, and federal contractor operations where constitutional violations might operate through institutional coordination that avoids traditional federal oversight. Comprehensive constitutional protection, announces Attorney General Thompson, requires federal investigation that examines systematic institutional patterns rather than isolated violations. Federal civil rights enforcement must address institutional coordination that enables systematic constitutional violations. Congressional authorization expands federal civil rights investigation authority to examine systematic patterns in federal agencies, military installations, immigration facilities, and federal contractor operations where constitutional violations might operate without adequate federal oversight or accountability. Federal civil rights enforcement becomes systematic institutional feature that provides permanent constitutional accountability through real-time monitoring, community coordination, and federal intervention that prevents systematic bias from achieving institutional entrenchment through political coordination. Permanent federal civil rights enforcement, explains constitutional law expert Professor Janet Wilson, represents recognition that constitutional protections require systematic institutional support, rather than crisis response to systematic violations that achieve institutional protection through political coordination. Agent Kellens' undercover operation becomes federal civil rights training model that prepares investigators for systematic institutional investigation that documents constitutional violations through methods that institutional corruption cannot anticipate or circumvent through adaptive coordination. Undercover constitutional investigation, she explains to Federal Law Enforcement Conference, succeeds through understanding that systematic institutional violations operate as normal practice rather than exceptional criminal activity. Federal investigation must document institutional patterns rather than individual crimes. Federal civil rights protection expands internationally as foreign governments request training in constitutional enforcement that prevents systematic institutional violations from achieving political protection through coordination that shields constitutional abuse from democratic accountability. International constitutional protection, announces State Department Human Rights Division, requires systematic institutional support rather than crisis response to constitutional violations that achieve systematic operation through political coordination that prevents democratic accountability. But systematic constitutional protection faces ongoing challenges from institutional resistance that adapts through political coordination, legal challenges, and administrative coordination designed to circumvent federal oversight while maintaining systematic bias through subtle institutional practices. Federal monitoring reveals systematic attempts to undermine civil rights enforcement through budget restrictions, personnel limitations, administrative obstacles, and legal challenges designed to prevent federal oversight from achieving permanent institutional accountability. Institutional resistance to federal civil rights enforcement, warns Civil Rights Quarterly Assessment, operates through systematic coordination designed to prevent permanent federal oversight while maintaining constitutional violations through adaptive institutional practices that avoid federal detection. Constitutional protection requires permanent commitment that extends beyond individual federal investigations or temporary political support. Systematic institutional change depends on generational dedication to constitutional principles that transcend political cycles and institutional resistance. Federal civil rights enforcement continues as permanent institutional feature that provides constitutional accountability through systematic monitoring, community coordination, and federal intervention that prevents systematic bias from resuming operation through institutional adaptation. Constitutional protection succeeds, Agent Kellens concludes in Federal Civil Rights Annual Report, through systematic institutional commitment rather than temporary federal investigation. Permanent constitutional accountability requires generational dedication that transcends political cycles and institutional resistance. 5 years after Sterling's conviction, federal civil rights protection operates as systematic institutional practice that provides constitutional accountability through permanent federal oversight, community participation, and institutional reforms that address systematic patterns rather than individual violations. Statistical analysis demonstrates sustained improvement in constitutional compliance across federal judicial system where systematic monitoring prevents institutional bias from resuming operation through political coordination or administrative circumvention of federal civil rights enforcement. Systematic constitutional protection concludes federal civil rights 5-year assessment, requires permanent institutional commitment that addresses systematic patterns through community participation, federal oversight, and institutional accountability that transcends political cycles and institutional resistance. But new challenges emerge as institutional corruption adapts through technological manipulation, administrative coordination, and political influence designed to circumvent federal oversight while maintaining systematic constitutional violations through methods that avoid traditional federal detection. Federal investigation discovers systematic use of artificial intelligence systems to coordinate constitutional violations between jurisdictions, algorithmic bias that achieves systematic discrimination through technological methods, and administrative automation that conceals institutional bias behind technical procedures. Technological constitutional violations, announces Federal Civil Rights Technology Task Force, require federal investigation that understands systematic institutional adaptation through technological methods designed to achieve constitutional violations while avoiding human accountability through automated processes. Agent Kellens receives promotion to Deputy Assistant Director of Federal Civil Rights Technology Division that investigates systematic constitutional violations operating through technological systems designed to achieve institutional bias while avoiding federal detection through algorithmic manipulation. Advanced institutional corruption, she explains to Senate Judiciary Technology Subcommittee, operates through technological systems that achieve systematic constitutional violations while maintaining appearance of objective automated processing that conceals institutional bias behind technical procedures. Federal legislation creates comprehensive technological oversight that examines algorithmic bias, automated decision-making, artificial intelligence systems, and technological coordination that might achieve systematic constitutional violations through methods that traditional federal oversight cannot adequately monitor. Technological constitutional protection, explains legislation sponsor Senator Maria Rodriguez, requires federal oversight that examines systematic institutional patterns operating through technological systems rather than traditional human coordination that federal civil rights enforcement historically addressed. Federal civil rights enforcement adapts through technological investigation methods, algorithmic analysis, systematic data monitoring, and technological accountability that addresses institutional bias, operating through automated systems designed to circumvent traditional federal oversight. Systematic technological constitutional protection, announces Federal Civil Rights Strategic Plan, requires federal enforcement that evolves through technological sophistication rather than traditional investigation methods that institutional corruption can circumvent through technological adaptation. Constitutional protection continues as evolving systematic institutional commitment that addresses emerging challenges through adaptive federal enforcement, community participation, and technological oversight that prevents systematic constitutional violations from achieving institutional protection through technological circumvention. Constitutional protection requires, Agent Kellens concludes in congressional testimony on technological civil rights enforcement, systematic institutional adaptation that addresses emerging challenges rather than static federal oversight that institutional corruption can circumvent through technological or political innovation. But the fundamental principle remains constant. Constitutional protections apply to every American citizen regardless of race, economic status, or social credentials that some officials believe determine who deserves constitutional rights. Federal civil rights enforcement exists to ensure that constitutional principles operate as enforceable reality rather than theoretical guarantees. 10 years after Operation Justice Denied, federal civil rights protection operates as permanent systematic institutional feature that provides constitutional accountability through adaptive federal oversight that addresses emerging challenges while maintaining fundamental commitment to constitutional principles. Constitutional protection succeeds, concludes Federal Civil Rights Decennial Assessment, through systematic institutional commitment that adapts to emerging challenges while maintaining fundamental constitutional principles that apply equally to every American citizen regardless of political cycles, institutional resistance, or technological circumvention. Agent Kellens retires after 25 years of federal civil rights enforcement that transformed systematic constitutional violations into permanent federal oversight, community accountability, and institutional reforms that address systematic patterns rather than individual violations. Federal civil rights enforcement, she reflects in retirement ceremony address, succeeds through systematic institutional commitment rather than individual heroism. Constitutional protection requires generational dedication that transcends political cycles and institutional resistance through permanent commitment to constitutional principles. But constitutional protection continues through new federal investigators who understand that systematic institutional violations require permanent vigilance, community participation, and federal oversight that addresses emerging challenges while maintaining fundamental commitment to constitutional rights. Constitutional protection never ends, explains newly appointed FBI Civil Rights Division Director Marcus Thompson, because institutional corruption continuously adapts through new methods designed to circumvent federal oversight while maintaining systematic constitutional violations through emerging coordination techniques. Federal civil rights enforcement continues as permanent institutional commitments that provides constitutional accountability through adaptive systematic oversight that addresses emerging challenges while maintaining fundamental constitutional principles that apply equally to every American citizen. House Judiciary Committee hearings uncover evidence of systematic coordination between federal district courts nationwide, revealing institutional networks designed to share constitutional violation techniques, coordinate resistance to federal oversight, and maintain systematic bias through inter-district collaboration. Multi-district constitutional violations, testifies committee investigator Sloan Carmichael, operate through systematic institutional coordination that transcends individual jurisdiction boundaries. Federal investigation reveals networks designed to circumvent federal civil rights enforcement through inter-district collaboration. The systematic coordination includes encrypted communications between federal judges, prosecutorial coordination designed to share constitutional violation techniques, administrative collaboration that conceals systematic bias through procedural manipulation, and institutional resistance networks that coordinate political challenges to federal civil rights enforcement. Federal investigation discovers systematic training programs designed to teach constitutional violation techniques while maintaining legal appearance, institutional coordination that shares methods for avoiding federal detection, and systematic political coordination designed to challenge federal civil rights enforcement through legislative and administrative obstacles. Institutional resistance to federal civil rights enforcement, explains Congressional Investigation Report, operates as systematic network rather than isolated jurisdictional problems. Constitutional violations achieve institutional protection through multi-district coordination that requires comprehensive federal response. Congressional legislation strengthens federal civil rights enforcement through expanded investigation authority, mandatory inter-district coordination monitoring, systematic institutional accountability, and comprehensive oversight that addresses network coordination rather than individual jurisdictional violations. Grassroots civil rights organizations expand systematic constitutional education, community oversight participation, federal coordination support, and institutional accountability that provides permanent vigilance against systematic constitutional violations, resuming operation through adaptive institutional techniques. Community constitutional protection, explains National Civil Rights Coalition Director Rosa Martinez, requires systematic participation that identifies institutional violations before they achieve systematic coordination. Federal civil rights enforcement succeeds through community partnership rather than isolated federal investigation. Community oversight councils receive federal authority to investigate constitutional complaints, coordinate with federal civil rights enforcement, and provide systematic accountability that prevents institutional bias from resuming operation through political coordination or administrative circumvention. Federal Civil Rights Community Partnership Program provides training, resources, coordination support, and institutional access that empowers neighborhoods to participate in constitutional protection through systematic oversight rather than crisis response to established institutional violations. Constitutional protection requires, explains community organizing training curriculum, systematic community participation that addresses institutional patterns rather than individual violations. Federal civil rights enforcement succeeds through community coordination that provides permanent vigilance against systematic bias. Universities establish federal civil rights research centers that examine systematic institutional patterns, develop analytical methods for identifying constitutional violations, and provide academic support for federal civil rights enforcement through systematic institutional analysis. Academic constitutional research, explains Harvard Civil Rights Research Institute Director Professor Janet Wilson, provides systematic analytical support that identifies institutional patterns before they achieve systematic coordination. Federal civil rights enforcement benefits from academic research that examines emerging constitutional violation techniques. Federal grants support constitutional protection research that examines systematic institutional patterns, develops investigation methods, analyzes statistical indicators of constitutional violations, and provides academic foundation for federal civil rights enforcement evolution. Constitutional law curriculum expands to include systematic institutional analysis, civil rights investigation methods, community organizing techniques, and federal enforcement coordination that prepares legal professionals for constitutional protection rather than traditional legal practice. Constitutional Legal Education Bar explains American Bar Association Civil Rights Section, requires systematic institutional training rather than traditional legal education that focuses on individual cases. Federal civil rights enforcement benefits from legal professionals who understand systematic institutional patterns. International human rights organizations request federal civil rights enforcement training, systematic constitutional protection methods, and institutional accountability techniques that prevent constitutional violations from achieving political protection through governmental coordination. International constitutional protection, announces United Nations Human Rights Council, benefits from federal civil rights enforcement experience that addresses systematic institutional violations through community participation, federal oversight, and institutional accountability that transcends political cycles. Federal civil rights enforcement provides international training, consultation support, institutional analysis, and systematic constitutional protection methods that address emerging global challenges to constitutional rights through governmental coordination and institutional resistance. International constitutional protection coordination strengthens global civil rights enforcement through systematic sharing of investigation methods, institutional accountability techniques, and community organizing strategies that address constitutional violations operating through governmental coordination. Global constitutional protection, explains State Department Human Rights Bureau, requires systematic international coordination that addresses institutional patterns rather than isolated violations. Federal civil rights enforcement contributes to global constitutional accountability through international cooperation. Federal civil rights enforcement develops artificial intelligence systems for detecting systematic constitutional violations, algorithmic analysis that identifies institutional bias patterns, and technological oversight that addresses constitutional violations operating through automated systems. Technological constitutional protection, explains FBI Civil Rights Technology Division, requires federal enforcement that evolves through technological sophistication rather than traditional investigation methods. Systematic constitutional violations adapt through technological circumvention that requires technological federal response. Federal legislation creates comprehensive algorithmic accountability that examines automated decision-making systems, artificial intelligence bias, technological constitutional violations, and systematic institutional coordination operating through technological methods designed to circumvent traditional federal oversight. Constitutional protection technology includes real-time statistical monitoring, pattern recognition systems, algorithmic bias detection, and automated federal intervention that prevents systematic constitutional violations from achieving institutional coordination through technological circumvention. Systematic technological constitutional protection, announces Federal Civil Rights Strategic Technology Plan, provides permanent federal oversight that addresses emerging technological challenges rather than reactive investigation of established systematic violations. Federal civil rights enforcement examines systematic economic discrimination that operates through financial institution coordination, employment discrimination networks, and economic exclusion systems that achieve constitutional violations through economic rather than legal methods. Economic constitutional violations, explains Treasury Department Civil Rights Division, operate through systematic financial institution coordination that achieves constitutional discrimination through economic exclusion rather than legal violation. Federal civil rights enforcement must address economic systematic patterns. Federal investigation discovers systematic coordination between financial institutions designed to exclude minority communities from economic opportunity through lending discrimination, insurance redlining, and investment exclusion that achieves constitutional violations through economic coordination. Economic constitutional protection includes federal oversight of financial institution coordination, systematic economic discrimination monitoring, and federal intervention that prevents economic exclusion from achieving constitutional violation through financial systematic coordination. Comprehensive constitutional protection, explains Federal Reserve Civil Rights Division, requires federal oversight that addresses economic systematic patterns rather than isolated financial violations. Constitutional rights include economic opportunity that systematic coordination cannot exclude through financial discrimination. Federal civil rights enforcement examines systematic healthcare discrimination that operates through medical institution coordination, insurance exclusion networks, and healthcare access systems that achieve constitutional violations through medical rather than legal discrimination. Healthcare constitutional violations, explains Health and Human Services Civil Rights Division, operate through systematic medical institution coordination that achieves constitutional discrimination through healthcare exclusion. Federal civil rights enforcement must address healthcare systematic patterns. Federal investigation discovers systematic coordination between healthcare institutions designed to exclude minority communities from medical access through insurance discrimination, medical redlining, and treatment exclusion that achieves constitutional violations through healthcare coordination. Healthcare constitutional protection includes federal oversight of medical institution coordination, systematic healthcare discrimination monitoring, and federal intervention that prevents medical exclusion from achieving constitutional violation through healthcare systematic coordination. Medical constitutional protection, explains Centers for Disease Control Civil Rights Division, requires federal oversight that addresses healthcare systematic patterns rather than isolated medical violations. Constitutional rights include healthcare access that systematic coordination cannot exclude through medical discrimination. Federal civil rights enforcement examines systematic environmental discrimination that operates through industrial coordination, zoning exclusion networks, and environmental justice systems that achieve constitutional violations through environmental rather than legal discrimination. Environmental constitutional violations, explains Environmental Protection Agency Civil Rights Division, operate through systematic industrial coordination that achieves constitutional discrimination through environmental exclusion. Federal civil rights enforcement must address environmental systematic patterns. Federal investigation discovers systematic coordination between industrial institutions designed to exclude minority communities from environmental protection through zoning discrimination, pollution concentration, and environmental justice exclusion that achieves constitutional violations through environmental coordination. Environmental constitutional protection includes federal oversight of industrial coordination, systematic environmental discrimination monitoring, and federal intervention that prevents environmental exclusion from achieving constitutional violation through industrial systematic coordination. Environmental constitutional protection, explains Council on Environmental Quality Civil Rights Division, requires federal oversight that addresses environmental systematic patterns rather than isolated pollution violations. Constitutional rights include environmental justice that systematic coordination cannot exclude through industrial discrimination. Federal civil rights enforcement examines systematic educational discrimination that operates through institutional coordination, academic exclusion networks, and educational access systems that achieve constitutional violations through educational rather than legal discrimination. Educational constitutional violations, explains Department of Education Civil Rights Division, operate through systematic academic institution coordination that achieves constitutional discrimination through educational exclusion. Federal civil rights enforcement must address educational systematic patterns. Federal investigation discovers systematic coordination between educational institutions designed to exclude minority students from academic opportunity through admissions discrimination, funding exclusion, and academic access limitation that achieves constitutional violations through educational coordination. Educational constitutional protection includes federal oversight of academic institution coordination, systematic educational discrimination monitoring, and federal intervention that prevents educational exclusion from achieving constitutional violation through academic systematic coordination. Academic constitutional protection, explains National Science Foundation Civil Rights Division, requires federal oversight that addresses educational systematic patterns rather than isolated academic violations. Constitutional rights include educational opportunity that systematic coordination cannot exclude through academic discrimination. Federal civil rights enforcement continues evolving through systematic institutional adaptation that addresses emerging challenges while maintaining fundamental constitutional principles that apply equally regardless of political cycles, institutional resistance, or technological circumvention. Constitutional protection evolution concludes Agent Kellen's and final federal civil rights assessment, requires systematic institutional commitment that adapts to emerging challenges while maintaining fundamental constitutional principles. Federal civil rights enforcement succeeds through permanent adaptation rather than static oversight. Constitutional protection operates as permanent systematic institutional feature that provides accountability through adaptive federal oversight, community participation, institutional reforms, and emerging challenge response that addresses systematic patterns rather than individual violations. Federal civil rights enforcement, she reflects in comprehensive civil rights memoir published after retirement, succeeds through understanding that systematic institutional violations require systematic institutional response. Constitutional protection depends on permanent commitment that transcends political cycles and institutional resistance. But constitutional protection faces continuous challenges from institutional adaptation, technological circumvention, political coordination, and systematic resistance designed to maintain constitutional violations through methods that avoid federal detection while achieving systematic bias. Constitutional vigilance never ends, she concludes, because institutional corruption continuously adapts. Federal civil rights enforcement provides systematic protection that evolves through permanent commitment to constitutional principles rather than temporary political support or crisis response. The legacy of Operation Justice Denied continues through permanent federal civil rights enforcement that addresses systematic institutional patterns, community participation in constitutional protection, and adaptive oversight that evolves to meet emerging challenges while maintaining fundamental constitutional rights. 7 years after Sterling's conviction, Agent Kellens receives encrypted communication through channels that avoid federal monitoring systems, suggesting systematic coordination that operates beyond documented institutional networks previously investigated through Operation Justice Denied. The communication includes statistical analysis suggesting constitutional violation patterns, resuming operation through methods that circumvent federal oversight, systematic coordination that adapts through technological sophistication, and institutional resistance that operates through political coordination designed to challenge federal civil rights enforcement. Advanced institutional corruption, the message explains through untraceable electronic communication, adapts through systematic coordination that federal investigation has not yet identified. Constitutional violations resume through institutional networks that operate beyond documented patterns. The message includes evidence of multi-state judicial coordination, prosecutorial networks that share constitutional violation techniques, and administrative systems designed to coordinate resistance to federal civil rights enforcement through systematic institutional collaboration. Federal investigation scope expands to examine systematic coordination that operates through encrypted communication, technological circumvention of federal oversight, and institutional networks that coordinate constitutional violations through methods that previous federal investigation did not identify. Systematic constitutional violations, Agent Kellens reports to Federal Civil Rights Command, continue evolving through institutional coordination that adapts to federal oversight. Constitutional protection requires continuous investigation that addresses emerging systematic patterns rather than documented institutional networks. Federal civil rights enforcement adapts through technological investigation that examines encrypted communication networks, systematic institutional coordination analysis, and emerging constitutional violation pattern identification that addresses institutional adaptation designed to circumvent federal oversight. Constitutional protection evolution, she explains to Congressional Oversight Committee examining emerging institutional corruption patterns, requires federal enforcement that adapts continuously rather than static oversight that institutional corruption can circumvent through systematic coordination evolution. But the fundamental mission remains constant. Constitutional protection that ensures equal rights regardless of race, economic status, or institutional coordination designed to exclude minority communities from constitutional guarantees that apply to every American citizen. Federal civil rights enforcement, Agent Kellens concludes in testimony examining emerging constitutional challenges, succeeds through systematic adaptation that addresses institutional evolution while maintaining fundamental constitutional principles that transcend political cycles and institutional resistance. Constitutional protection continues through permanent federal oversight that evolves to meet emerging challenges while maintaining fundamental commitment to constitutional rights that apply equally to every American citizen regardless of systematic institutional coordination designed to achieve constitutional violations through adaptive methods. Federal investigation discovers encrypted communications that suggest systematic coordination extending beyond documented institutional networks, involving unnamed federal officials whose identities remain classified, and institutional connections that federal oversight has not yet identified or investigated. Statistical analysis reveals constitutional violation patterns that correlate with political cycles, suggesting institutional coordination that operates through electoral timing, and systematic bias that adapts through political coordination designed to circumvent federal civil rights enforcement. Systematic institutional coordination, Federal Investigation Quarterly Report acknowledges, operates through methods that federal oversight continues investigating. Constitutional violations adapt through systematic patterns that require ongoing federal investigation rather than concluded institutional accountability. Congressional classified briefings examine federal investigation findings that remain sealed pending ongoing investigation. Institutional coordination that extends beyond public documentation, and systematic constitutional violation networks that operate through classification that prevents public accountability. Classified constitutional investigation that Congressional Oversight Committee report acknowledges through redacted public summary, examines institutional coordination that requires classified investigation methods. Federal civil rights enforcement continues addressing systematic patterns that classification protects pending investigation completion. Federal grand jury proceedings examine evidence of systematic institutional coordination that operates through classification. Testimony that remains sealed pending ongoing investigation, and constitutional violation networks that federal investigation continues documenting through classified investigation methods. Constitutional protection, Agent Kellens acknowledges in final classified briefing, requires ongoing investigation that addresses systematic institutional coordination operating beyond public documentation. Federal civil rights enforcement continues through classified investigation that protects ongoing constitutional accountability. But even classified federal investigation acknowledges that constitutional protection depends ultimately on community vigilance, institutional accountability, and permanent federal commitment that transcends political cycles and institutional resistance regardless of classification or systematic coordination. Constitutional vigilance, she concludes in unclassified public statement, requires community participation that operates independently of federal investigation. Constitutional protection succeeds through permanent commitment that transcends institutional coordination and federal oversight limitations. Constitutional protection continues as permanent institutional commitment that addresses systematic violations through adaptive federal enforcement, community participation, and institutional accountability that evolves to meet emerging challenges while maintaining fundamental constitutional principles. Federal civil rights enforcement operates as evolving systematic institution that provides constitutional accountability through permanent oversight rather than crisis response to systematic violations that achieve institutional coordination before federal intervention. Constitutional protection requires, Federal Civil Rights Strategic Assessment concludes, systematic institutional commitment that adapts continuously rather than static federal oversight. Constitutional rights depend on permanent vigilance that transcends political cycles and institutional resistance. Community constitutional protection strengthens through systematic participation that provides permanent oversight, federal coordination that addresses emerging challenges, and institutional accountability that prevents systematic constitutional violations from resuming operation through adaptive institutional methods. Constitutional vigilance, community organizing assessment concludes, operates independently of federal investigation while supporting federal civil rights enforcement. Constitutional protection succeeds through community commitment that transcends institutional coordination and federal oversight limitations. Academic constitutional research continues examining systematic institutional patterns, developing investigation methods that address emerging constitutional violation techniques, and providing analytical support for federal civil rights enforcement that adapts to institutional evolution. Constitutional analysis, academic research assessment concludes, requires systematic institutional examination that addresses emerging patterns rather than documented violations. Constitutional protection benefits from academic research that examines institutional adaptation and systematic coordination. International constitutional protection coordination strengthens global civil rights enforcement through systematic sharing of investigation methods, institutional accountability techniques, and constitutional protection strategies that address emerging worldwide challenges to constitutional rights. Global constitutional protection, international coordination assessment concludes, requires systematic cooperation that addresses institutional patterns rather than isolated violations. Constitutional rights depend on international commitment that transcends governmental coordination and institutional resistance. Technological constitutional protection evolution continues developing investigation methods that address algorithmic constitutional violations, systematic institutional coordination through technological systems, and emerging constitutional challenges that operate through technological circumvention of traditional federal oversight. Technological constitutional protection, technology assessment concludes, requires federal enforcement evolution rather than traditional investigation methods. Constitutional rights depend on technological accountability that addresses systematic institutional adaptation through technological coordination. But constitutional protection ultimately depends on fundamental commitment that every American citizen possesses equal constitutional rights regardless of race, economic status, or systematic institutional coordination designed to exclude minority communities from constitutional guarantees. Constitutional principles, Agent Kellens concludes in final public statement, transcend institutional coordination, federal investigation, and political cycles. Constitutional protection succeeds through permanent commitment to fundamental rights that apply equally to every American citizen. Constitutional protection continues through generational commitment that maintains constitutional principles while adapting to emerging challenges, institutional evolution, and systematic coordination designed to circumvent constitutional accountability through adaptive methods. Constitutional vigilance never ends, she reflects in final assessment of federal civil rights enforcement evolution, because constitutional rights require permanent protection that adapts continuously while maintaining fundamental principles that transcend institutional resistance and systematic coordination. The mission continues through new federal investigators, community organizers, academic researchers, and constitutional advocates who understand that systematic constitutional violations require permanent vigilance, institutional accountability, and adaptive federal enforcement that evolves to meet emerging challenges while maintaining fundamental constitutional rights. Constitutional protection, the federal civil rights enforcement mission statement concludes, operates as permanent institutional commitment rather than temporary federal investigation. Constitutional rights depend on generational dedication that transcends political cycles, institutional resistance, and systematic coordination designed to circumvent constitutional accountability. Constitutional protection succeeds not through individual heroism or temporary federal investigation, but through systematic institutional commitment that maintains constitutional principles while adapting to emerging challenges that threaten constitutional rights through evolving institutional coordination. Federal civil rights enforcement continues as permanent institution that provides constitutional accountability through adaptive oversight, community participation, and institutional reforms that address systematic patterns while maintaining fundamental constitutional principles that apply equally to every American citizen. Constitutional rights, Agent Kellens concludes in final reflection on decades of federal civil rights enforcement, survive through permanent commitment that transcends individual cases, political cycles, and institutional resistance. Constitutional protection requires generational dedication to fundamental principles that define American democracy. The story of Operation Justice Denied demonstrates that constitutional protection depends on systematic institutional commitment rather than individual courage, permanent federal oversight rather than crisis response, and community participation that operates independently while supporting federal civil rights enforcement. Constitutional vigilance continues through every American citizen who understands that constitutional rights require permanent protection, systematic accountability, and adaptive institutional commitment that evolves to meet emerging challenges while maintaining fundamental constitutional principles. Democracy survives, she concludes, through constitutional vigilance that never ends because constitutional rights require permanent protection that transcends political cycles and institutional resistance. Constitutional principles endure through generational commitment that adapts continuously while maintaining fundamental rights.